Daeho Park wiped the sweat from his forehead as he finished checking the thermal regulation systems on the Deep Space Research Station Meridian. The station orbited a frozen moon in the outer rim, where temperatures outside dropped to -200 degrees. Inside the station, the heating systems worked hard to keep everyone comfortable at a steady 22 degrees. He walked down the long metal corridor toward the main research lab. His boots made soft clicking sounds on the floor. The walls were lined with pipes that carried heated air throughout the station. Daeho knew every pipe, every valve, and every sensor in the heating system. As the station's thermal engineer, it was his job to make sure nobody froze to death in the cold void of space. The research lab buzzed with activity. 4 different species worked together on a joint project, studying how life forms adapted to extreme cold. Daeho pushed open the door and stepped inside. The familiar smell of various alien foods and the sound of multiple languages filled the air. Bora Kim looked up from her workstation and smiled at him. She was the only other human on the station, working as a xenobiologist. Her black hair was tied back in a neat ponytail, and she wore the standard blue research uniform. "How are the heating systems today?" she asked. "Running perfectly," Daeho replied. "All temperatures normal across the station." Near the large viewing window, 3 alien researchers continued their work. Vexatal stood closest to the window, his crystalline body catching the light from the distant star. The Glacian looked like he was made of blue ice, with geometric patterns running through his transparent form. His species came from a world where water never existed as a liquid. Morden sat at a computer terminal, his thick white fur covering every inch of his massive frame. The Tundrak looked like a giant bear that had learned to walk upright and use tools. His people lived on ice worlds where the warmest day never got above -50 degrees. Silnith worked at another station, her scaled green skin reflecting the lab lights. The Cryolan moved with slow, careful motions. Her blood contained natural antifreeze chemicals that let her survive in temperatures that would kill most other life forms. Daeho walked over to check the environmental controls on the wall. The display showed all green lights. Everything looked normal. He was about to leave when alarms started blaring throughout the station. "Warning," the computer's voice announced. "Primary heating system failure detected. Emergency protocols activated." The lights flickered and changed to a dim red color. Everyone in the lab stopped what they were doing and looked around. Daeho rushed to the nearest control panel and started checking the readings. "What's happening?" Bora asked, moving closer to him. Daeho's fingers flew over the controls. "The main heating plant just shut down. Something hit the primary power coupling. The backup systems are starting, but they won't be enough." He looked at the temperature readings. "We're at 20 degrees now, but it's dropping fast." Vextal turned toward them, his crystalline form making soft chiming sounds as he moved. "How long before the backup systems fail?" "Maybe 6 hours if we're lucky," Daeho said. "The storm outside is making things worse. We're losing heat faster than the backups can make it." Morden's deep voice rumbled across the lab. "The emergency shelter has its own power source. We could all wait there until repairs are finished." "That shelter is tiny," Silnith said. "It would be very crowded with all of us inside." The temperature display on the wall now showed 18 degrees and falling. Daeho could already feel the air getting cooler. The heating vents that usually blew warm air had gone silent. Vextal made what sounded like laughter, though it came out as musical tones. "This should be interesting. My people live in temperatures that would instantly freeze most other species. A little cold won't bother me." Morden nodded his massive head. "My fur keeps me warm in much worse conditions than this. I could sleep comfortably in a blizzard." Silneth's scaled lips curved into a smile. "My blood doesn't freeze until -60 degrees. Cold weather actually makes me feel more energetic." Bora moved closer to Daeho. "We should probably head to the emergency shelter. Humans aren't built for extreme cold like they are." "Humans," Vextal said, his voice taking on a mocking tone. "Always so dependent on their machines and artificial environments? Your species never learned to adapt to harsh conditions naturally." "You need your heated buildings and warm clothes just to survive on your own homeworld," Morden added. "How will you handle real cold?" The temperature display now showed 15 degrees. Daeho could see his breath starting to form small clouds in the air. He looked at the three aliens who all seemed completely comfortable despite the dropping temperature. "Actually," Daeho said slowly, "I think we'll be fine." Bora stared at him. "Daeho, are you crazy? It's going to get much colder than this." Silneth's eyes glittered with amusement. "The human thinks he can outlast us in the cold." "How amusing." Vextal's crystalline body began to glow brighter as the temperature dropped. "This gives me an idea. Why don't we make this interesting? A little wager to pass the time while we wait for repairs." "What kind of wager?" Daeho asked. "Simple," Vextal replied. "We all stay in this lab. No emergency shelter, no extra heating, no special equipment. Whoever gives up first and runs to the warm shelter loses." Morden's fur seemed to fluff up as he got excited about the idea. "I like it. What are the stakes?" "Research credits," Silneth suggested. "A month's worth from each person. The winner takes all." "You can't be serious," Bora said to Daeho. "They're built for cold weather. We're not." The temperature was now at 12 degrees and still falling. Ice crystals started forming on the metal surfaces near the windows. The aliens looked perfectly comfortable, while Bora had started shivering slightly. Daeho looked around the lab, taking note of various equipment and supplies. His engineering mind was already working on the problem. "All right," he said. "I accept your wager." "Daeho!" Bora grabbed his arm. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that evolution gave different species different advantages," he replied calmly. "They evolved to handle cold temperatures, but humans evolved something else." Vextal's musical laughter filled the lab. "And what might that be?" "We evolved the ability to change our environment instead of adapting to it," Daeho said. "We'll see which approach works better." The aliens exchanged glances and seemed to share some private amusement. To them, the outcome was obvious. Humans were fragile creatures who needed artificial environments to survive. They had natural advantages that millions of years of evolution had given them. "This will be the easiest credits I've ever earned," Morden rumbled. "I almost feel bad taking advantage of them," Silneth added, though her smile suggested she didn't feel bad at all. The temperature display now showed 10 degrees. The air was cold enough that everyone's breath was visible. Ice began forming on the inside surfaces of the windows. The aliens looked completely at ease, while Bora wrapped her arms around herself to stay warm. "So we're all agreed?" Vextal asked. "No one leaves this lab until someone gives up and runs to the emergency shelter. The last person or people standing win everyone else's research credits." "Agreed," Daeho said. "This is insane," Bora muttered, but she nodded her agreement as well. The wager was set. 4 species would compete to see who could handle the extreme cold better. The aliens were confident in their natural advantages. They had evolved specifically for harsh, cold environments. Humans, on the other hand, were known throughout the galaxy for their preference for warm, comfortable conditions. What the aliens didn't know was that Daeho Park had grown up learning traditional Korean ways of staying warm. His grandfather had taught him about saunas and heat therapy. More importantly, his engineering training had taught him how heat worked and how to control it. As the temperature continued to drop, Daeho began looking around the lab with new eyes. He wasn't seeing laboratory equipment anymore. He was seeing raw materials and tools. The challenge wasn't about surviving the cold. It was about engineering a solution to turn the cold into an advantage. The real contest was just beginning. The temperature display on the wall now showed 8 degrees, and the number kept getting smaller. Daeho watched it drop to 7 degrees, then 6. The lab had become noticeably colder in just 30 minutes since the heating system failed. Ice crystals spread across the windows like delicate white flowers blooming in fast motion. Vextal stood near the large viewing window, completely relaxed. If anything, he seemed more comfortable than before. His crystalline body had begun glowing, with a soft blue light that grew brighter as the temperature dropped. The geometric patterns inside his transparent form pulsed with energy. "This feels wonderful," Vextal said, his voice creating musical tones in the cold air. "My body absorbs energy more efficiently in low temperatures. I could stay like this for weeks." Morden had settled into a corner of the lab where he could lean against the wall. His thick white fur had fluffed up even more, creating what looked like a natural winter coat. The massive tundrak breathed slowly and deeply, each breath creating large clouds of vapor that quickly disappeared. "The cold feels like home," Morden rumbled. "On my world, we consider anything above -40 to be warm weather. This is barely cool to me." Silnith moved around the lab with smooth, flowing motions. Her scaled green skin showed no signs of being affected by the cold. If anything, she seemed more alert and energetic than usual. She flexed her fingers and stretched her arms, testing her mobility. "My blood circulation actually improves in cold temperatures," she explained. "The antifreeze proteins in my system work better when it's cold. I feel more alive now than I did when it was warm in here." Bora sat at her workstation, wrapped in her research jacket. She had pulled the hood up over her head and stuffed her hands into the pockets. Her breath came out in visible puffs, and she had started shivering despite trying to hide it. "Deho," she said quietly, "maybe we should reconsider this. The temperature is dropping faster than I expected." The display now showed 4 degrees. Deho could feel the cold air on his skin, but he remained calm. He walked slowly around the lab, looking at different pieces of equipment and supplies. His eyes moved from the emergency supply closet to the maintenance panels to the various research tools scattered around the room. "Are you already giving up?" Vextal asked with amusement. "I told you humans weren't built for real environmental challenges." "Your species always takes the easy path," Silnith added. "Heated buildings, warm clothes, artificial environments. You never learn to handle nature on its own terms." Deho opened the emergency supply closet and began examining what was inside. He found several thermal emergency blankets, the kind that reflected body heat back to the user. There were also emergency heating packs, small chemical devices that produced heat when activated. Various tools and maintenance supplies filled the shelves. "What are you looking for?" Mordoon asked. "Extra clothes won't help you when the temperature gets really cold." "Just seeing what's available," Deho replied. He pulled out several of the emergency blankets and set them on a nearby table. The blankets were thin and lightweight, made of a reflective metallic material. The temperature display showed 2 degrees now. Ice was forming on the metal surfaces throughout the lab. The air felt sharp and thin when anyone breathed it in. The aliens continued to look completely comfortable, while Bora's shivering had become more noticeable. Vexatal's crystalline form was now glowing brightly enough to cast blue light around his corner of the lab. "I'm actually feeling better than I have in months. My people generate internal energy through crystallization processes that work best in sub-zero temperatures. This reminds me of winter hunting season back home," Morden said. "I used to sleep outside in weather much colder than this. My fur regulates my body temperature automatically." Silnith stretched again, moving her arms and legs in fluid motions. "Cold weather makes my species more flexible and stronger. We evolved during ice ages on our home world." Deho moved to the maintenance area and found several loose metal panels that were normally used for equipment repairs. They were flat sheets of reflective metal about the size of large dinner trays. He carried several of them back to where he had placed the emergency blankets. "Now what is he doing?" Silnith wondered aloud. "Building some kind of primitive shelter," Vextal said with musical laughter. "Humans always try to hide from environmental challenges instead of facing them directly." The temperature display reached 0 degrees. The lab was now officially at the freezing point of water. Every surface in the room had developed a thin layer of frost. When anyone spoke, their words came out as clouds of vapor that hung in the air for several seconds before disappearing. Bora's teeth had started chattering despite her efforts to stay warm. She pulled her jacket tighter around herself and tucked her hands under her arms. "Deho, I don't think I can handle much more of this. Just give me a few more minutes," he said calmly. He walked over to the hydroponics bay in the corner of the lab. This area was used for growing plants as part of their research. Along with the plant containers, there were decorative elements, including smooth river rocks that had been brought from Earth. Deho began collecting these rocks, choosing ones that were about the size of his fist. The stones were dense and heavy, perfect for what he had in mind. He carried them back to his work area and set them next to the blankets and metal panels. "Rocks?" Mordoon asked. "Are you planning to throw them at the cold to make it go away?" The aliens found this extremely amusing. To them, Deho appeared to be gathering random junk in a desperate attempt to create some kind of protection against the cold. They had natural advantages that millions of years of evolution had given them. A few rocks and blankets wouldn't change anything. The temperature display showed -2 degrees. The lab was now colder than the inside of most home freezers. Ice covered the windows completely, blocking the view of space outside. The metal walls and ceiling had developed thick layers of frost that sparkled in the light. Vextal was practically glowing like a beacon now. His crystalline body pulsed with bright blue energy. This is perfect temperature for my people. I could live like this permanently. I'm getting sleepy, Mordoon said contentedly. Cold weather always makes me want to hibernate. I could take a nice long nap right here. Silneth moved in a series of flowing stretches that looked almost like a dance. My reflexes are faster now. My strength is increasing. Cold temperatures optimize all of my physical systems. Bora stood up from her workstation and walked over to Deho. Her movements were stiff, and she kept her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Please tell me you have a real plan. I can't feel my fingers anymore. Trust me, Deho said. He opened several of the emergency heating packs and read the instructions on the packages. These were chemical heat sources that activated when exposed to air. Each pack could produce heat for several hours once opened. The temperature display reached -5 degrees. The lab was now significantly colder than the inside of a typical home freezer. Every breath created large clouds of vapor. The frost on the surfaces had grown thicker, creating intricate ice patterns on the walls and equipment. I have to admit, Vextal said, I'm impressed that you humans have lasted this long. I expected you to run to the emergency shelter by now. Most species would have given up already, Silneth agreed. But you're obviously suffering while we're thriving. Deho activated several of the emergency heating packs and placed them near the rocks he had collected. The chemical reaction inside the packs began generating heat immediately. He could feel warmth radiating from them even in the freezing air. Chemical heat sources won't help much, Mordoon observed. They don't produce enough energy to warm a whole room. Who said anything about warming the room? Deho replied. The temperature continued dropping. -8 degrees, -10. The cold was becoming severe enough to be dangerous for most life forms. The aliens remained completely comfortable, their natural adaptations protecting them from the harsh conditions. Bora moved closer to Deho, seeking whatever warmth she could find. Her shivering had become constant now, and her face was pale from the cold. I don't understand what you're trying to do. Just wait, he said. My grandfather taught me something when I was young. He said that sometimes the best way to fight the cold isn't to make yourself tougher. Sometimes it's better to make the cold work for you. The aliens watched with growing curiosity as Deho arranged his materials in what seemed like a random pattern. They still believed the outcome of their wager was obvious, but they were beginning to wonder what the human was planning. As the temperature display showed -12 degrees and continued falling, the real test was about to begin. The aliens had their natural advantages, but Deho had something else. He had human ingenuity and the knowledge of how to turn simple materials into something more powerful than the sum of their parts. The stones near the heating packs were beginning to warm up. The temperature display showed -15 degrees and kept falling. The lab had become a frozen landscape of ice and frost. Every surface sparkled with thick layers of ice crystals. The air was so cold that it hurt to breathe deeply. Even the aliens had begun to notice that the temperature was dropping faster and further than any of them had expected. Deho worked methodically with his collected materials. The rocks he had gathered from the hydroponics bay were now sitting next to the activated heating packs. The chemical heat sources glowed with steady warmth, slowly transferring their energy to the dense stones. He tested the temperature of the rocks with his hand, nodding with satisfaction as they grew warmer. The stones are absorbing heat from the chemical packs, he explained to Bora, who stood close beside him for whatever warmth she could share. Dense materials like rock can store a lot of thermal energy. Once they get hot, they stay hot for a long time. Bora's teeth were chattering so hard she could barely speak. How is that going to help us when the whole room is freezing? You'll see, Deho said. He began arranging the metal panels he had collected from the maintenance area. The reflective sheets could be connected together using simple clips and fasteners that he found in the supply closet. Working quickly but carefully, he started building what looked like a small tent frame. Vexatal watched from his position near the window. His crystalline body was now glowing so brightly that he cast blue shadows on the walls. The human is building a shelter. How primitive. He thinks hiding under metal sheets will save him from the cold. It's like watching our ancestors from millions of years ago, Morden rumbled. Before technology, before civilization, just basic survival instincts. Silneth moved closer to observe Deho's work. This is actually fascinating from an anthropological perspective. We're seeing how humans behave when their technology fails them. They revert to basic tool-making and shelter building. The temperature display reached -20 degrees. The cold was now severe enough to be life-threatening for most species. Ice covered every surface in the lab so thickly that it looked like the inside of a freezer that had been running for years. The air itself seemed to sparkle with ice crystals. Deho continued assembling his structure. He used the metal panels to create walls and a roof, leaving one side open for now. The reflective surfaces faced inward, creating a small, enclosed space that was just big enough for two people to sit inside comfortably. "Why are you using the shiny side of the metal facing in?" Bora asked. "Heat reflection," Deho explained. "When heat energy hits a reflective surface, it bounces back instead of being absorbed. This will help keep heat inside the enclosure instead of letting it escape." He pulled the emergency blankets from the supply pile and began attaching them to the metal frame. The thin, reflective material served as both insulation and additional heat reflection. Layer by layer, he was creating an enclosed space that could trap and hold thermal energy. "I have to admit," Vextal said, "the human shows more ingenuity than I expected. But a simple shelter won't change the fundamental problem. The cold will get inside eventually. Heat always moves from warm areas to cold areas," Silneth observed. "Basic thermodynamics. His little tent might slow down heat loss, but it won't stop it completely." The temperature display showed -25 degrees. The lab was now colder than the surface of some planets. The aliens remained comfortable, their natural adaptations protecting them from conditions that would kill most other life forms. But even they were beginning to show slight signs that the extreme cold was more intense than they had anticipated. Deho checked the stones again. The rocks were now quite warm from absorbing heat from the chemical packs. He carefully picked up one of the stones using a piece of cloth to protect his hands. The rock radiated heat like a small furnace. "Now I understand," he said with satisfaction. "My grandfather used to tell me stories about traditional Korean saunas called jjimjilbangs. They used heated stones to create steam and warmth. The principle is simple, but very effective." He placed the hot stones inside his makeshift shelter, arranging them carefully on a metal tray to protect the floor. The rocks immediately began, radiating heat into the enclosed space. The temperature inside the shelter started rising, creating a pocket of warmth in the freezing lab. "Heated stones," Bora said, beginning to understand. "They'll keep producing heat for hours as they cool down." "Exactly," Deho replied, "and the reflective walls will bounce that heat around inside the enclosure instead of letting it escape. We're creating a microenvironment with its own thermal regulation." He activated more heating packs and placed them around additional stones. As each rock heated up, he added it to the collection inside the shelter. The enclosed space began to warm significantly, creating a stark contrast with the freezing air outside. Morden's fur had started to show signs of the extreme cold. Ice crystals were forming on the tips of his whiskers, and his breathing had become more labored. The human's little fort might provide some protection, but it's still just delaying the inevitable. "Heat sources like those chemical packs only last for a limited time," Vextal pointed out. "When they burn out, he'll be right back where he started." Deho smiled and pulled a small container from the supply closet. It held distilled water that was used for equipment maintenance. That's where the traditional sauna technique comes in. Heated stones plus water equals steam. Steam carries much more thermal energy than dry air. He poured a small amount of water onto one of the hot stones inside the shelter. The water immediately turned to steam with a satisfying hissing sound. The steam rose and filled the enclosed space, carrying heat throughout the interior and raising the humidity. "Steam?" Silneth asked. What purpose does that serve? Humid air feels warmer than dry air at the same temperature, Daeho explained. Plus, the steam helps distribute heat evenly throughout the space. It's like having a natural heating system. The temperature display reached -30 degrees. The lab was now colder than many planets could support life. Even the aliens were beginning to show more obvious signs of being affected by the extreme conditions. Vextal's glow had become so bright it was almost painful to look at directly. Morden's movements had slowed, and ice was forming on his fur. Silnith's usual fluid grace had become somewhat stiff. Inside Daeho's improvised sauna, the temperature was completely different. The enclosed space had reached a comfortable 20 degrees and was still warming up. The combination of heated stones, reflected heat, insulated walls, and humid steam had created an oasis of warmth in the frozen wasteland of the lab. "Come on," Daeho said to Bora. "Time to get out of the cold." Bora didn't need to be asked twice. She quickly crawled into the shelter beside Daeho. The difference was immediate and dramatic. Inside the enclosure, the air was warm and humid. The heated stones radiated steady warmth, and the reflective walls bounced that heat around the interior space. "This is incredible," Bora said, her shivering finally stopping. "It's actually warm in here. How warm is it?" Daeho checked a small thermometer he had brought from the supply closet. 25 degrees and rising. The stones are still heating up. Outside the shelter, the three aliens watched in growing amazement. What they had thought was a primitive survival attempt had turned into something much more sophisticated. The humans hadn't just built a shelter. They had engineered a complete thermal management system using basic materials and simple principles. "How is that possible?" Vextal asked. "The ambient temperature out here is -30 degrees. Heat can't just appear from nowhere." "It's not appearing from nowhere," Daeho called out from inside his warm enclosure. "I'm using the same heat energy that was already available, just concentrating it and controlling how it moves. The chemical heating packs provide the energy. The stones store it and release it slowly. The reflective walls keep it contained. The steam distributes it evenly. The temperature display showed -35 degrees. The aliens were still surviving, but they were no longer as comfortable as they had been. The extreme cold was pushing even their specialized adaptations toward their limits." Inside the improvised sauna, Daeho added more water to the stones, creating fresh clouds of warm steam. The interior temperature had reached 30 degrees, making it not just warm but actually quite comfortable. He and Bora sat in shirt sleeves, completely protected from the life-threatening cold just inches away outside their enclosure. "This is like being in a spa," Bora said in amazement. "I'm actually starting to sweat." "That's the idea," Daeho replied. "Traditional Korean saunas are designed to make you sweat even in cold weather. It's supposed to be good for your health." The aliens stared at the shelter in disbelief. They had natural advantages that evolution had given them over millions of years. But the humans had taken basic materials and simple physics principles and created something that was outperforming biological adaptation. As the temperature outside continued to drop toward -40 degrees, the humans were sitting comfortably in their own private warm environment, actually sweating from the heat while their alien competitors struggled with conditions that were beginning to challenge even their specialized biology. The contest was far from over, but the dynamics had completely changed. The temperature display showed -40 degrees and continued dropping. The lab had become an alien landscape of ice and frozen air. Every piece of equipment was covered in thick layers of frost that looked like white armor. The walls sparkled, with ice formations that grew like crystal gardens across every surface. Even the air itself seemed thick and heavy with cold. Inside his improvised sauna, Daeho adjusted the heated stones and added more water to create fresh steam. The interior temperature had stabilized at a comfortable 35 degrees. He had removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves. Bora sat beside him, no longer shivering, her cheeks flushed with warmth from the humid air. "I can't believe this is working so well," she said, wiping perspiration from her forehead. "It's actually getting too warm in here." "That's the beauty of thermal engineering," Daeho replied. "Once you understand how heat moves and how to control it, you can create almost any environment you want. The hard part is having the right materials and enough energy source." He checked his supply of heating packs. About half of them were still unused, and the activated ones would continue producing heat for several more hours. The stones were doing their job perfectly, absorbing the chemical heat and releasing it slowly and steadily into the enclosed space. Outside the shelter, the three aliens were beginning to experience the extreme cold in ways they had not expected. The temperature had dropped far beyond what any of them had anticipated when they made their wager. Vextal stood near the frozen window, his crystalline body now glowing so intensely that he looked like a blue star. But the brilliant light was not entirely a good sign. His species absorbed energy in cold temperatures, but there were limits to how much energy his crystalline structure could handle safely. "The thermal differential is becoming problematic," he admitted, his musical voice sounding strained. "My body is absorbing energy faster than my crystalline matrix can process it safely." Tiny stress fractures had begun appearing in his transparent form. The lines ran like spider webs through his geometric internal patterns. Each fracture sparkled with released energy, creating brief flashes of light that were beautiful but concerning. Morden had curled up in a corner, wrapping his massive arms around his knees in an attempt to conserve body heat. His thick white fur, which had seemed like perfect protection earlier, was now working against him. Ice crystals had formed throughout his coat, and the moisture from his breath was freezing on his whiskers and around his nose. "My fur is losing its insulating properties," he rumbled, his deep voice muffled by the cold. "The extreme temperature is causing ice formation within the hair follicles. This is colder than anything my species evolved to handle." His movements had become slow and stiff. The massive Tundrak, who had seemed invincible against cold weather just hours ago, was now struggling with the extreme conditions. His natural advantages were being overwhelmed by temperatures that exceeded his biological limits. Silneth continued to move around the lab, but her motions were no longer the fluid, graceful stretches she had displayed earlier. Her scaled skin had taken on a slightly blue tint, and her movements had become mechanical and jerky. "My antifreeze blood is still functioning," she said, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. "However, my motor functions are being impaired by the extreme cold. My reaction time has decreased significantly." The temperature display reached -50 degrees. The lab was now colder than the surface of many frozen worlds. Equipment that was not designed for such extreme conditions began to malfunction. Computer screens flickered and went dark. Metal surfaces became brittle and made sharp cracking sounds as they contracted from the cold. Inside the sauna, Daeho monitored the conditions outside through a small gap in his shelter walls. "The temperature is dropping faster than their bodies. Can adapt," he observed. "Evolution gave them advantages for cold weather, but this is going beyond normal cold weather into extreme survival territory." "Are they going to be okay?" Bora asked with concern. "They'll survive, but they're discovering that even biological advantages have limits," Daeho replied. "No species evolves to handle every possible extreme. There's always a point where the environment becomes too harsh." He added fresh heated stones to their collection and poured more water to create additional steam. The sauna was now so warm and humid that both humans had to remove their outer shirts to stay comfortable. The contrast with the deadly cold outside was remarkable. Vexatal's crystalline form suddenly flashed with a brilliant pulse of light. More fractures appeared in his structure, spreading outward from the stress points like cracks in glass. "My energy absorption capacity is reaching dangerous levels," he announced. "If the temperature continues to drop, my crystalline matrix could experience catastrophic failure." The beautiful geometric patterns inside his transparent body were now chaotic and unstable. The very adaptation that made him thrive in cold weather was threatening to destroy him in temperatures this extreme. Morden tried to stand up but found his movements severely limited. Ice had formed between the layers of his fur, creating a rigid shell that restricted his mobility. "I cannot maintain adequate circulation in these conditions," he admitted. "My extremities are losing sensation." The massive bear-like alien, who had boasted about sleeping comfortably in blizzards, was now struggling with basic motor functions. His breath came out in large clouds of vapor that immediately turned to ice crystals and fell to the floor like snow. Silneth's condition was perhaps the most concerning. Her antifreeze blood was still protecting her from freezing, but the extreme cold was affecting her nervous system. Her movements had become increasingly erratic and uncontrolled. Motor coordination severely impaired, she reported in a flat, mechanical voice. Cognitive functions beginning to slow. Reaction time now at 40% of normal levels. The temperature display showed minus 60 degrees. The lab had become a death trap for most forms of life. Even specialized cold weather equipment was beginning to fail under the extreme conditions. But inside the human-engineered sauna, the temperature remained a steady 38 degrees with perfect humidity control. We should probably offer to let them come inside, Bora suggested. This is getting dangerous for them. The wager was their idea, Deho pointed out. But you're right. Safety comes first. He called out to the aliens. The offer is open if any of you want to share the shelter. There's room for everyone. Vextol's pride was still intact, despite his obvious distress. A Glacian does not admit defeat to thermal conditions, he said, though his voice had lost its earlier musical quality and now sounded strained and harsh. Morden tried to shake his head but found the movement difficult. Tundrak warriors do not surrender to weather, he growled, though his words came out slurred from the cold affecting his speech. Silaneth remained silent, focused on maintaining basic motor functions as her nervous system fought against the extreme. Temperature. The temperature continued falling, minus 65 degrees, minus 70. The aliens were reaching the absolute limits of their biological adaptations. Their natural advantages, which had seemed so overwhelming at the beginning of the contest, were being pushed beyond their design parameters. Inside the sauna, Deho maintained perfect environmental control. He rotated the heated stones to ensure even heat distribution, adjusted the steam levels for optimal humidity, and monitored the internal temperature to keep it in the ideal range for human comfort. This is actually quite relaxing, he said to Bora. My grandfather would have been proud to see traditional Korean sauna techniques being used in space. It's incredible that something so simple can be so effective, Bora replied. You took basic materials and physics principles and created something that's outperforming millions of years of evolution. Outside their warm refuge, the three aliens were learning a hard lesson about the difference between biological adaptation and technological adaptation. Evolution had given them advantages for specific environments, but human engineering could create advantages for any environment. As the temperature display approached minus 75 degrees, it was becoming clear that the contest would not end the way anyone had expected when the wager was first made. The temperature display showed minus 80 degrees, and the numbers were still falling. The lab had become a frozen wasteland that resembled the surface of a dead world. Ice covered every surface in thick layers that sparkled like crystal armor. The air itself seemed to crackle with cold, and any equipment not specifically designed for extreme conditions had long since stopped functioning. Inside the improvised sauna, Deho and Bora sat comfortably in the warm, humid air. The internal temperature had stabilized at a perfect 40 degrees with ideal humidity levels. Both humans had stripped down to their lightest clothing, and Bora was using a small towel to wipe perspiration from her face. I think I'm actually getting too hot, she said with amazement. 6 hours ago, I thought we were going to freeze to death, and now I'm sweating in a space sauna. Deho checked his remaining supplies. He still had several unused heating packs, and the stones were maintaining their temperature perfectly. The thermal engineering principles were working exactly as he had calculated. We could keep this running for another 12 hours if necessary, he said. The system is completely self-sustaining now. Outside their warm shelter, the three aliens were facing the harsh reality that even the most advanced biological adaptations had absolute limits. The extreme cold had pushed each of them beyond what their evolutionary advantages could handle. Vextal's crystalline body was now a network of stress fractures and energy discharges. The brilliant blue glow had become unstable, flickering and pulsing erratically as his internal structure struggled to process the massive amounts of energy his body was absorbing. Bright flashes of light erupted from the fracture points like miniature lightning strikes. Crystalline matrix approaching critical failure, he announced, his musical voice now harsh and distorted. Continued exposure to these thermal conditions will result in permanent structural damage to my body. The geometric patterns inside his transparent form had become chaotic and unpredictable. What had once been beautiful, organized designs now looked like shattered glass reflecting light in random directions. His species' greatest advantage in cold weather had become a dangerous liability in temperatures this extreme. Morden lay curled in a tight ball in the corner, his massive frame shaking with involuntary tremors. The thick white fur that had been his pride and protection was now a frozen shell that restricted his movement and conducted cold directly to his skin. Ice crystals covered his entire body, making him look like a statue carved from white stone. "Cannot maintain core body temperature," he admitted through chattering teeth. "Fur has lost all insulating properties. Muscle coordination failing." His deep rumbling voice had become weak and shaky. The mighty Tundrak warrior, who had boasted about sleeping in blizzards, was now barely able to speak coherently. Silneth's condition was perhaps the most serious of all. Her anti-freeze blood was still protecting her from freezing solid, but the extreme cold had severely impaired her nervous system. She moved in jerky, uncontrolled motions like a broken robot, and her usually sharp mind had slowed to a crawl. "Cognitive functions at 20%, she reported in a flat, emotionless voice. "Motor control severely compromised. Reaction time approaching dangerous levels." The temperature display reached -85 degrees. At this point, the cold was life-threatening even for species specifically adapted to harsh environments. The aliens' natural advantages were not just inadequate, they were actively working against them as their bodies tried to cope with conditions beyond their biological design limits. A brilliant flash of light suddenly erupted from Vextal's crystalline form, followed by a sharp cracking sound that echoed through the frozen lab. A major fracture had appeared down the center of his torso, and energy was leaking out in visible streams of blue light. "I concede," Vextal announced, his voice now barely recognizable. "Continued participation in this contest would result in permanent injury. The humans have won this challenge." He began moving slowly toward the emergency shelter, his crystalline body flickering like a broken lamp. Each step caused new fractures to appear, and trails of energy leaked from his damaged structure. The proud Glacian, who had been so confident in his natural cold weather advantages, was retreating in defeat. Morden tried to stand up to follow Vextal, but his frozen fur and impaired muscle coordination made movement nearly impossible. He managed to get to his hands and knees, but standing upright was beyond his current capabilities. "I also concede," he growled through gritted teeth. "My body has reached its limits. The humans have demonstrated superior adaptation to these conditions." Deho emerged from his sauna and quickly moved to help the struggling Tundrak. Despite the bitter cold outside his shelter, he was able to assist Morden in getting to his feet and moving toward the emergency shelter. The massive alien leaned heavily on the human for support, an ironic reversal of their expected physical capabilities. Silneth remained motionless for several long moments, her impaired nervous system struggling to process the situation. When she finally spoke, her voice was slow and mechanical. "Conceding defeat. Requesting assistance to reach emergency shelter." Bora emerged from the sauna to help guide Silneth towards safety. The cryoland's movements were so unsteady that she needed constant support to avoid falling. Her anti-freeze blood had kept her alive, but it could not prevent the severe impairment of her motor functions. As the three aliens retreated to the emergency shelter, the temperature display showed -90 degrees. The lab had become uninhabitable for virtually any form of life, yet the humans' improvised sauna continued to maintain a perfect internal environment of 40 degrees with optimal humidity. "We should probably join them in the emergency shelter now," Bora suggested. "We've proven our point." "Actually," Deho said with a smile, "I'm quite comfortable right here. Why don't we wait until the heating system comes back online? This sauna is actually quite relaxing." An hour later, the emergency repair teams finally restored power to the main heating system. As warm air began flowing through the vents again, the temperature in the lab slowly started to rise. The thick layers of ice began to melt, creating small rivers of water across the floor. The aliens emerged from the emergency shelter looking embarrassed and humbled. Their natural adaptations had failed them when faced with truly extreme conditions, while the humans had not only survived but thrived using nothing but basic materials and engineering principles. "I owe you an apology," Vextal said, his crystalline form still showing the fractures from his ordeal. "I underestimated human capabilities. Your species may not have evolved for cold weather, but you have something perhaps more valuable. What's that? Deho asked. The ability to adapt your environment to suit your needs rather than adapting yourselves to the environment, Vextal replied. Evolution gave us advantages for specific conditions, but engineering gives you advantages for any conditions. Morden nodded his massive head, his fur still damp from melted ice. My people have always respected strength and natural ability, but what you did today showed a different kind of strength. The strength to solve problems instead of just enduring them. Silnith, her nervous system slowly returning to normal function, managed a weak smile. I've studied many species and their survival adaptations, but I've never seen anything like what you accomplished today. You took basic physics principles and simple materials and created something that outperformed millions of years of biological evolution. It's not about being superior, Deho explained. Different species have different advantages. You're naturally adapted for cold weather in ways that humans never could be. But humans evolved the ability to use tools and engineering to change their circumstances. We don't just survive environments, Bora added. We engineer solutions to master them. As the lab returned to its normal temperature, the aliens transferred their research credits to the humans as agreed. But more importantly, they had gained a new respect for human ingenuity and problem-solving abilities. Would you be willing to teach us about thermal engineering? Vexatal asked. I think our species could benefit from understanding how to control environmental conditions rather than just adapting to them. I'd be interested in learning about your sauna techniques, Morden added. The concept of using heated stones and steam for comfort is fascinating. Deho smiled and began dismantling his improvised sauna, carefully explaining each component and its function. The principles are actually quite simple. Heat storage, thermal reflection, insulation, and humidity control. Once you understand how heat moves and how to control it, you can create almost any environment you want. As he packed away the heated stones and reflective panels, Deho reflected on the lesson they had all learned. Evolution created specialists, but humans had become something different. They were generalists who used intelligence and engineering to adapt to any situation. The aliens had bet that the humans would freeze first, but they had learned something more valuable than research credits. They had discovered that sometimes the most powerful adaptation is not the ability to survive in extreme conditions, but the ability to change those conditions entirely. In the end, the real victory was not about who could handle the cold better.